Welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you all here tonight. It's our inaugural panel 2023 at Mind and Life Europe. My name is Gábor Kársai. I'm the Managing Director of MLE. And I would like to welcome you all, welcome our panelists today and everyone who is following us on YouTube. As you may remember, 2 years ago, we had a very special theme, Varela 2030, commemorating Francisco Varela's passing, and the Embodied Mind book, the 30th anniversary of the publication. Last year, we had another umbrella theme that we followed throughout the whole year called Standing at the Edge. And I would like to show you a little card here if the title slide is taken out. This is our Standing at the Edge value card that we use at Mind and Life Europe. We have some other cards that we use in our meetings and discussions, inspiring us a lot. And when we found this topic last year, we didn't imagine, that was in the beginning of 2022, that the whole year would be affected by standing at the edge. We remember everything that happened last year throughout the whole world, probably in our personal lives, in our work life as well. So we were standing at the edge. So when we were thinking about this year's theme, we thought, what about finding another probably less edgy card that we have at Mind and Life Europe? And we chose this one, Take Care, Taking Care, hoping that we would not fall over the edge or collapse, but we would look for more meaning and caring in our lives these years by taking care, by caring for life. So I hope that 2023 will bring this energy, this attitude, this feeling, this behavior, this atmosphere, what caring for life would mean for us all. And I hope that this panel tonight will inspire us all to consider this topic deeply throughout our work and life during this year. Now I would like to turn to my colleague, dear Johanna, who is our programs manager at Mind and Life Europe, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Gábor. And just a couple of words before I offer the introductions of each panelist about the theme. As Gábor mentioned, we put a lot of thought as a team, but also as a wider community, into how to hold this theme in a way that would be reflective of our work at MLE. And inspired as we are by the inactive approach, we wanted to take up caring in an integrated sense, not simply falling back on the common view of humans as separate agents acting on a broken world, but recognizing care also as somehow constitutive of our being alive and of our being embedded in social, biological, and geological ecosystems. While it's true that we can practice or cultivate caring in a deliberate fashion, we can also realize that caring is somehow foundational to being a human being for whom the world is conceived and constructed based on what we care about. So hopefully we'll be able to weave in and out of these two perspectives, the relative and the absolute, as it were, throughout tonight's discussion, and reflect on caring as it may concern us personally, but also in a planetary sense, intellectually, but also existentially. So Amy Varela will be on hand as our moderator for the evening, and we'll offer a few more remarks in just a moment. But before that, I wanted to briefly introduce our 7 panelists and our moderator for this evening in alphabetical order. So our first panelist, Elena Antonova, is a senior lecturer in psychology at Brunel University London, which she joined in June of 2019. Prior to that, she was a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London, where she remains a visiting researcher. Elena's research focuses on the effects of long-term mindfulness practice using neuroimaging and psychophysiology methods with the application to the prevention and management of psychopathologies. Elena has had a personal meditation practice since 1998 and has attended numerous meditation retreats in 2001, mainly studying and practicing in the Dzogchen approach. Our second panelist, Amber Carpenter, is a philosopher and works in ancient Greek and classical Indian philosophy with a topical focus on the metaphysics, epistemology, and moral psychology underpinning Plato's ethics and Indian Buddhist ethics. Her work increasingly brings Greek and Indian Buddhist philosophy together around topics at the intersection of metaphysics, mind, epistemology, and ethics. She's also interested in the contemporary relevance of ancient views, as well as much interdisciplinary work, as in her collaboration on the Integrity Project. She recently held a fellowship with the Beacon Project, exploring ethical ambitions and the formation of character in Plato and in Buddhist thought, and is currently running an international grant-funded project on Buddhism and Platonism. Our third panelist, Edel Maex, is a psychiatrist and well-known Zen teacher living in Antwerp, Belgium. Teaching mindfulness became his way to integrate his Zen practice and his practice and as a psychiatrist. He founded the stress clinic at the Ziane Hospital in Antwerp, and he's the author of several books on mindfulness and Buddhism, including Mindfulness in the Maelstrom of Life. Our fourth panelist, Giuseppe Pagnoni, is associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Science at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia in Italy. After a master's in physics, he completed a Ph.D. in neuroscience and worked for several years in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He has led several neuroimaging studies on diverse topics, including reward processing, the interaction of immune and brain function, social cognition, intrinsic brain activity, pain processing, mental effort, and meditation. He's currently interested in the application of the predictive coding framework to the study of contemplative practices. Our fifth panelist, Matthieu Ricard, well known to many here and watching us on YouTube, is a Buddhist monk at the Shechen Monastery in Nepal. He received a PhD in cellular genetics at the Institut Pasteur in France under the Nobel laureate François Jacob. He has lived in the Himalayas since 1972, studying with Kangye Rinpoche and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, two very respected Tibetan spiritual masters. Since 1989, he has served as the French interpreter for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he's the author of many well-known books, including The Monk and the Philosopher, The Quantum and the Lotus, Happiness, A Guide to Developing Life's Most Important Skill, and Altruism, The Power of Compassion to Change Yourself and the World. He donates all the proceeds from his books and much of his time to over 100 humanitarian projects in Tibet, Nepal, and India through his charitable association, Karuna Shechen. Our sixth panelist, Donato Scholler, is a philosopher who, in 2018, co-founded the international research project called Embodied Critical Thinking, together with a colleague from Iceland. She is currently the academic director of training in embodied critical thinking, an Erasmus Plus strategic partnership in higher education, in which 5 major European universities currently collaborate. In recent years, she has been a guest professor at DePaul University in Chicago, a fellow at the Max Weber Colleague Center at the University of Erfurt, and is currently a guest professor at the University of Iceland, as well as a senior lecturer at the University of Koblenz. Our seventh panelist, Katherine Weare, is professor at the University of Exeter, where she directs the Masters of Science program in mindfulness and has been the principal investigator for the MLE Community of Contemplative Education, also known as the CCE. Katherine is known internationally for her work on well-being, social and emotional learning, and mindfulness in education. She has published very widely, reviewed the evidence base, and advised the UK government, the European Union, and the World Health Organization. Her recent best-selling book, co-written with the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, Happy Teachers Change the World, is being translated into 10 languages. And last but not least, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Amy Cohen Varela, who is currently the chairperson of the Mind and Life Europe board and has been involved with Mind and Life since its inception. She's also a clinical psychologist specializing in psychodynamic therapy and philosophy. Amy studied comparative literature at Brown in Columbia before moving to Paris in the early 1980s, where she received her degree in clinical psychology from the University of Paris 7, with a specialty in psychodynamic theory and practice, and in parallel completed psychoanalytic training. So with that, I would love to pass the baton to you, Amy, to get us started into this evening. And a really hearty thank you to all of the panelists for joining us this evening and bringing your voices into this collective exploration.
Thanks, Joanna and Gabor. I'm also very joyous to be with you here and start the new year. Thank you, panel members, and thank you all who are coming to watch us online. And I'd also like to thank the Mind and Life community members who joined us during, along with our team, who joined us to think and debate as we were pondering about what kind of theme to banner theme, or we call it the umbrella theme, to decide on for 2023. And we had a lot of very dynamic and wonderful discussions in bigger and smaller groups around this theme of caring for life. And now I'd also like to thank the MLE team, Gabor, May, Derek, and Johanna, and particularly Johanna, for crafting the absolutely beautiful concept note that she wrote for our website, in which, if you haven't yet seen, you can access on our website. So this kind of event, in my opinion, really exemplifies what we're trying to do at Mind and Life Europe, which is to create a kind of a tent, but a mobile one, a portable one, that's open on all sides. Under the shelter of this tent, or this canopy, we can meet and probe the questions that are counting the most for us right now. For now, as Tolstoy's hermit, from the story of the 3 questions, now is always the right time to start something. Under the tent today, we have a really beautiful, diverse group of thinkers and agents in the world, and each of them is bringing us a precious gift, the gift of their expertise and their world of experience. Each of them brings a perspective that is partial, but profound. Our hope, and also our conviction, is that their dialogue, the dance of these perspectives that we'll see this evening, will get us all moving, both in our minds and in our lives. So I wanted to start us off with another quote from our good friend Evan Thompson, from his book Mind in Life. And he says, in mind science, the proposition that life prefigures mind and mind belongs to life has been called the strong continuity thesis of life and mind. Or I, Evan, prefer to call it the deep continuity of life and mind. According to this thesis, life and mind share a basic set of organizational properties, and the organizational properties distinctive of mind are an enriched version of those fundamental to life. Mind is lifelike, and life is mind-like. Evan maintains that this life-mind continuity is not just organizational, but phenomenological. It includes all the subjective and experiential aspects of mental life. This suggests that the natural roots of intentionality, the natural roots of concern, and the natural roots of caring are lodged in the very processes of metabolism in life. So with this idea of this intimate connection between life and caring in our minds, I thought maybe we could go around the table and I would ask each one of you to say a few words on what comes to your mind when you hear the word caring from your perspective, both your professional perspective, your expertise, and that of your life. Maybe we could start with Matthieu.
Wow, okay, well, thank you, Amy. So care is one of the words of the constellation or the declination of altruism, compassion, benevolence, and consideration for others. But it's a very nice word because it's sort of acceptable to everyone. You know, there are famous classic economics who said that there's no place for altruism in the economic system. So they may say, well, compassion is great, but it's not my job. But they cannot say anymore, I don't care for future generation. I don't care for poverty in the midst of plenty. I don't care for the environment. So care, I think, is a perfect word, although it doesn't translate well in French, so sorry, but it's a very good word for a broad perspective on the notion, I think, of altruism. But the meaning is basically the same. Yes.
Thank you, Matthieu. Maybe we could move on to Amber.
Thank you. So I have, I think, two very different sorts of things that come to mind when I think of care. So from my professional or my work life, broadly speaking, I hit upon care because it is, as Matthieu just said, sort of the perfect word. And for me, it was perfect in this sense, when I'm trying to convey the virtue of karuna in Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist ethics, care captures the active sense. Caring is something that one actively does. There are caring professions. It's something that engages the whole of a person. There's no question about care being just a feeling. Caring is something that one does and that is manifested in activity. And the more that I sort of reflect on it, the more it seems to me that it's even better than capturing the active aspect of karuna. It actually, I think, captures really nicely something that defies categorization into agent and patient or active and passive. It really unites these aspects together in a single thing. So for me, caring can carry that kind of connotation that I think is very important, because I think we get often misled by false distinctions into an artificial pure agency, artificial pure patiency, or being done to passivity. So that's what, for me, in my work life, when I'm thinking in the context of conveying and translating and understanding Buddhist ethics and ethics generally, what care has come to mean, the connotations that I think it carries. In my personal life, the caring has been recently very present. My mother, who is somebody who should be being cared for, she's at that age, is the full-time carer for both her mother and her invalid brother. And it's a real exemplification for me of what caring can mean as a lived reality, but also the way that it can be overwhelming. And so another of the things that for me I think about when we're supposed to care is the way that caring can become a burden and overwhelming, and thinking about how one can live a life that incorporates care without that becoming something overwhelming. Yeah.
Thank you, Amber. Yes, that subject reminds me of a distinction that you made, Giuseppe, in one of our meetings about care as being also etymologically worry and concern. Maybe you'd like to say something now?
Right. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, when the topic of care came up, yeah, I immediately thought about the various meanings associated with it. In Italian, care is cura, and but that has a kind of a threefold meaning. The first is like taking care of somebody, avere cura di qualcuno, and it's similar, I think, perhaps to the English translation equivalent, but perhaps it's less patronizing, as a less patronizing slant, in the sense that there's no sense of someone more able helping out somebody who's less able. It has more the connotation of a sort of a delicate touch, like handling something fragile. The second meaning is something, as you said, similar to worry. So something that occupies our mind, and in English is the same. Maybe, when you say carefree, without a worry. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if this is similar to keeping something in mind, like the notion of sati, like keeping something on our mind. And the third meaning actually is very equivalent to the English term healing. So maybe taking care of someone with this kind of unimposing and unobtrusive attitude is already a form of healing, especially for the soul. But there's so many things about the notion of care, but I will stop here for now, so to let the other people, and maybe then we can come back together.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Edel, I think you're resonating. You have to unmute.
Okay. Yes, I like all the connotations of the Italian cura. The first thing that came to my mind when you asked that question, what comes to your mind with the word care, is actually was a slide on a conference on palliative care in the hospital where I worked by the head oncologist. And his first slide was the text, "At the dawn of mankind, there was care." And I loved that when he said that, and I was in a way surprised because he was such a an oncologist, scientific, and then yes, at the dawn of mankind there is care. There was care. Maybe at the dawn of life there was care. None of us would be here if not someone in one way or another, or not someone, many people had cared for us. So it's so basic care, yeah, and that's what comes to my mind.
Thanks, Edel. Thank you. How about Katherine? Katherine Weare.
This Katherine?
This Katherine, yes.
This time there's only one Katherine.
There's only one.
There's often many Katherines.
Right.
Well, I've on the lead up to this, I've been pondering the word and how I use it and how it might be used in education. And as people talk, I've had so many other thoughts that I've become bored with what I thought before, but I'll try and stick to the point. There's just so much richness here. I've been pondering where I'm coming from right now in terms of my own work is an interest in encouraging people in education at every level, really, to put relationships, trust, love, sympathy, empathy at the heart of what they're doing. And along with caring about things such as the development of the inner person, rather than a model of education that is coming from outside and you have to learn things that other people give you. A model of education that isn't just a sausage machine process, but where the person is at the heart of it, and where individuals matter, and where we've got a concern for inclusion and diversity. So that's my particular model. It includes things like contemplative education and mindfulness, and possibly more broadly social and emotional learning, but in a way moving out from that right into everything about the school or the university or the college as a system, where the ethos and the whole process matters. So it's the individual in their context is what interests me, and in a sense trying to inspire people with that vision of what education could be, and at the same time thinking, well, where are they starting from? Because there's no point in having blue sky visions that don't mean anything to hard-pressed, burnt-out teachers. So trying to think, I was also thinking about how the word care might be used by more mainstream teachers or in education. And I had various thoughts about that I won't talk about in detail, but things like having a duty of care to young people. Every teacher recognises that one, the need to look after well-being and safeguarding. Every teacher, I think, understands the importance of relationships. What gets in the way is their own burnout and their own knowing how to realise that. So there's often a real gap between aspiration and delivery, but teachers do understand that and so on. And then there is this smaller segment of those of us who are interested in social and emotional learning and relationships, in which the word care is synonymous with the kind of things that Matthieu was talking about. Growing interest in compassion, growing interest in self-care. So I think you can find ways to use this kind of word as a shorthand for things that resonate right through the education system, but you're always banging up against people's difficulty in the real world of trying to realize that vision when they're so hard pressed, when there's so many children in the class, there's so much mental health problems. So it's a complex picture, really. And it interests me very much. And I found reflecting on this word just a really helpful, useful process. So thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you. And finally, Donata.
Yes, well, I resonate very much with Katherine saying that the word care resonates through the education system on so many levels. And I also resonate with Giuseppe, who brought, and I found that very beautiful, who brought this connotation of healing. And it made me think that, there's also this intuition, or that philosophy has a potential for healing. Yeah, like Wittgenstein says, philosophy has the potential to get us out of the traps our own thinking created. And I think that very much also is what the active approach achieves. And I came up with this term reflexive care, and it is a work in progress to spell it out. It kind of emerged in this context of embodied critical thinking that was initiated by Sigridur Torgersdottir and me. And I just think that in a time where there's so much emphasis on artificial intelligence and interest in data and big data, and so much distraction, media distraction, social media distraction, there is so paradoxically little talk about how to develop our skill of thinking to navigate those complex systems. Mm-hmm. And especially also in academia, this focus on quantity, pressure to cover maximal materials, to publish in order not to perish. It leaves so little spaces and methods to develop one's ideas, to carefully formulate the relevant questions, to clarify the confusions, and it needs a form of care that kind of still doesn't seem very much manifest, at least in the conventional academic settings that I was used to. And we are really trying to bring in care in terms of listening deeper to each other, longer to each other, helping us to listen to ourselves, and creating conditions to get in touch with this embodied ground of thinking where surprising new ideas can develop. Yeah. I stop here because, or else I would say much more, better to park.
Well, we will have time to pick up on this, and I'm sure it's resonating with the other panelists as well. There's already some resonances I can hear. Elena.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, when I first sort of tried to connect with that care for life in my professional life, of course, that sort of meaning of care is taken care of, that originally sprang to mind. But then as I started thinking about it deeper from the point of view of contemplative neuroscience and doing contemplative neuroscience, being contemplative neuroscientist, with everything that has been said that I absolutely also on board with, I would like to bring those notions of, and Donata has used this, we have to be careful, in our writing, that's care, as a scientist, we have to be careful every step of the way. And the care comes, it's a care to learn, it's care to understand, it's care to know. And then what do we do with this? Once we carefully learned, understood, what do we do with that? And then Giuseppe's, one of the translations Giuseppe gave of healing becomes very important. That notion that we have in empirical science, that science should be objective and not really connected to ethics. The way that the scientific knowledge is used is done, it's not in the hands of scientists, but the reality is science has a huge influence on our society, particularly Western society these days, right? And contemplative scientists in particular take a great care in the way that knowledge is generated, the carefulness of trying to understand the complexity of interdependence, the complexity of non-linearity, dynamic non-linearity of things, and so many other things. There's no very caring on us because it's quite a difficult nut to crack, right? I often feel like we have to be quite much more than we can chew compared to other fields, approaches in science where we sort of separate things on digestible bits and then try to put them together. We have this understanding it's not so simple, and we have to be careful not to forget that when we do, as Francisco said, when we do have to reduce a system to a particular network of things, we shouldn't forget that we have separated it from the whole of life, right? So again, then how we communicate this knowledge as scientists to other people, what influence, what impact it has on the rest of the society. So we don't fall into scientism, but we stay careful every step of the way with the understanding of the impact it's having on all of us. What are we communicating as scientists? So all of that has aspects of care for scientists. And on a more sort of personal level, as a scientist, of course, we have all these things that Katherine named, duty of care to our students, and not just the students we're teaching, at the undergraduate level, but our doctoral students, our postdocs, and care to ourselves to be able to provide all of that care. And actually, I think my first dawning of this, as I've been a contemplative practitioner, and altruism, giving to others, was always at the forefront, but actually starting to think about that balance, finding that balance, came from my first summer research institute at Carpenter, where, or maybe actually was the first Esri, where Martin Batchelor was the contemplative practitioner present there, and she very eloquently talked about this compassion, this care. It has to be 50-50, 50% for oneself. So we actually take care of our own well-being to be able then to take care of others. So yes, and care is a subtle dynamic balancing act. So I will end there.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Elena. Since we're getting started, I won't now I won't call on people and have a round, but I would like us to go to part 2 of Caring for Life, and that is the life side. We've been working a lot in Mind and Life Europe on our projects for our summer institutes, for the future summer institutes. And some of you know a lot about that because you've been working with us on planning a kind of a roadmap for the next 3 summer institutes. And one of the coupled pairs of concepts we've been thinking a lot about is the notion of sentience on the one hand. What is life? The question of the definition of life is extremely problematic and multifaceted, and also dependent on where you're coming from. I mean, AI was mentioned already. AI and robotics has changed our view of the definition of life. But in some sense, everyone's definition of sentience and of life comes from their experience. And we've paired this notion of sentience, of what is life, with the notion of responsibility. So that's already come up here. And several people have brought up this notion of duty to care. So the question would be, what is life? What is sentience? What is responsibility? Particularly in the context of ongoing crises like the climate emergency. Taking responsibility is both a duty and an opportunity. So in view of this articulation that we've been trying to make between sentience and responsibility, I'd like to just ask you to riff on that, how you see them as being articulated, simply how you see one or the other in your work and in your personal lives. And here, anybody who'd like to go into this question of what is life and what is responsibility is welcome to jump in. Katherine.
Small question.
Okay, it doesn't answer that question exactly, Amy, but taking it back to the work that I do in education, I think the starting point for an interest in the kind of things that you're talking about is to help all of us to feel more whole, to be whole people, you know, emotional, spiritual, physical, intellectual. And that's by no means the case in education, where so much focus is often on the intellectual. And Gabor talked about, you know, in academia, you know, the emphasis on the papers and the achievement, you know. So to have a world in which we cultivate the whole person, not just in, you know, a sort of banal sense, but in a deep, enriched sense, the embodied person is to me the basis for the vital capacity to connect inwardly with everything about ourselves, and therefore to start connecting with everything about nature and the planet and other people, and to recognize the permeable membrane between us and the rest of the world. I'm very influenced by the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, as you know, and his sense that this illusion of the separate person is very unhelpful, and to see the deep connection that is happening all the time. Excuse me, that's my phone, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
For me, this resonates a little bit with what Amber, you were saying about agency.
Anyway.
Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you. I said everything I needed to, I think.
I'm sorry, I got distracted by the question of translating sentience into French. Thinking about how difficult it is to translate these things even within European languages that are so closely related. And I often find that reflecting on that can be helpful for thinking about the boundaries of usefulness of our own words, whichever languages we're speaking, in this case, English. That sentience itself is something that it's true that it might be hard to determine and dispute you know, where the boundary is between sentience and non-sentience, but there's also a good question to be asked by what are we getting from the notion of sentience? What's important to us about it? And I see that the translation there in the chat focuses on the capacity to feel in a living being, and that's interesting. That the feeling part is the important part. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that I mean, it's pretty clear, although to me it's pretty clear, but I think to a lot of people that work in this field, that affective experience, it's a kind of a primary modality of consciousness, and so this is also in an evolutionary sense. So that kind of precedes all the higher level function and cognition, and so really this intention that we establish towards our environment and the other, it's really primary. It's really a generative of all the rest and all the higher form of cognition, I think. And so it's I think that it is indeed very central. even from let's say from a cognitive science point of view. But I also wanted to say another thing, that because I liked very much in the very beautifully put together document, there was the quote of Francisco, and maybe we should read it for the people that haven't seen it. Mm-hmm. And it says, it should not be surprising at this point that one of the main characteristics of spontaneous compassion, which is not a characteristic of volitional action based on habitual pattern, is that it follows no rule. So this, I think, is somehow linked to the notion of responsibility, but even more to ethical considerations. Because spontaneous care is not something that you can compute in terms of utility, even social utility. I mean, you can make case, but it's not something that can be prescribed rigidly through fixed ethical rules. And if that was the case, it would imply that at any time, we would be able to foresee precisely and completely all the long-term consequences of our compassionate act and evaluate it accordingly. Instead, I think that the spontaneous, the free character of compassion hints and reminds us of the finiteness of our capacity of knowledge and action. So I think this is a very interesting point for me, and I like the quote from Francisco very much because of this. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
Can I go? Yes. So while in Buddhism, sentience, at least in Tibetan, is what can move towards something that is increasing well-being or physical or mental integrity, and to move away in a non-mechanical way, like a plant will do. But if you may allow me, so make the difference between happiness and suffering, but even at the most basic level. But if I may come back on the few things that were some in the beginning, including some of the definition, about what Amber said about the action. I think this is a very interesting point. But maybe we could make the distinction between to care and then to be caring. Because there's been quite a debate whether altruism, for instance, which is the equivalent of care, has to be, if there's no action, there's no such thing as altruism. This is, for instance, Kristen Monroe in The Heart of Altruism, that's what she says. But if you look at Daniel Batson, he said, essentially, it's a motivation. It's an attitude, because you may be completely full of care and want to absolutely do what's needed to remedy to the cause of suffering and to bring happiness, but for the time being, you are not able to do so. And so nevertheless, the motivation is perfectly altruism and is not diminished by your momentary incapacity to do something. Now, the point is that if you can, yes, by all means, we should call to action. So karuna, compassion, is to the determination to remedy to suffering and its causes. It starts with the motivation, and as soon as possible, it's put into action in an unlimited way. So in a sense, it has to start with the motivation. Otherwise, you could have a behavior that seems to be altruistic and benevolent and caring, but could have many other motives. So it's good for the person who is the beneficiary of your care. But if you do that just to get the inheritance of a suffering old ladies, well, you can't say you are really caring. You're just helping for some self-interested reason. So in a way, yes, to be caring is to put that in action. And in terms of, and then when we say in Buddhism that karuna is to remedy to suffering and its causes, then it goes it's a much bigger agenda, because the cause of suffering goes back to ignorance. And so therefore you have a very cognitive aspect of caring, which is to try to dispel the basic distortion of reality that ends up in suffering at some point. And all this declination of what ignorance can be in terms of distorting the notion of self, the notion of permanence, the notion of autonomy, and so forth. And then just to say a few words, what Edel, the quotation that Edel said about the is professor of cancerology, is that, yes, of course, I think from evolution point of view, the down of humanity and of many species is definitely caring in sense of parental care. And that's the thing that we get through evolution. And then to a cognitive process, then we become able to extend first to other children, say, or to other vulnerable people that are not just our newborn. As the Dalai Lama said, we need care or compassion from the first day that we are born, otherwise we will not survive, and to the last day of our life, otherwise we will die very quickly if nobody cares for us. But then cognitively, we can manage to extend that to those who are not our kins, or to people who are not particularly treat us well. And so that cognitively, we can extend the circle of that care and eventually to unlimitless care and compassion. So many people, I met some philosophers who said, this is completely stupid, this idea you could have unconditional compassion. How can you do? You have to start with your children, with your dear ones. But the point here is not that you wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to stop all the wars and take everybody out of suffering. It's a motivation that you don't exclude anyone from your heart. And that's where you know, when Francisco said it has no rules, it means it's not directly linked with moral values. No, a dictator is an immense cause of suffering. So you may say, oh, well, no, I can't have any compassion for Putin or any of those guys. But in fact, it is an immense cause of suffering. So the compassion in that case, to know no rule, that means it should not be excluded anyone because of some kind of moral judgment or behavior, because compassion in that case take the form of wishing that may the anger, the paranoia, the psychopathic aspect of that person somehow may be remedied. Even maybe it's a wishful thinking, but at least that wish can fully apply to the most bloody dictator. So in that sense, it knows no limit and no rules in the sense of a rule that would be restricting that. So in our mind, it can be unconditional, even we know very well that we will not be able to actually apply it. So it starts with a motivation, which is indispensable to have a genuine sense of care and to be concerned. You know, the empathic concern from Daniel Batson is the root of then altruistic action. And as much as possible to the level of our capacity, then we should put it in action. So maybe that's one way to think about that.
Edel.
Yeah. Well, I think we care. That's how we are. What I like with Giuseppe, that if I understood him well, that one of the meanings in Italian of cura also is close to sati, is to we can only care when we notice, when we give attention to things. And that's the relationship between care and sentience. When you, I don't know, in Dutch we have the expression to have a heart of stone. I don't know if you have it in English and other languages. That's when you stop feeling, when you stop being sentient, and then that's the way we care. That's the starting point. But how do we lose that? How do we? Where does this caring stop the moment we stop feeling? And I, as a psychiatrist, I've seen so many people who have suffered violence, and one of the ways to deal with violence, with that suffering, is to become hard yourself, to make yourself your own heart into stone, and then you stop feeling, and then it repeats. And then sentience allows us to do something with our natural care, which is both receptive feeling and action at the same time. It's inseparable. But okay, there has to be this sentience to be able to care. And you can say, how can we help people to not alienate from their feeling, from their sentience, and be overwhelmed or have to protect themselves into something non-caring.
Donata.
I would like to resonate strongly with this. And I want to bring in another term, which is maybe a link between sentience and responsibility. It's responsiveness. Responsiveness. And I also wrote, while just now hearing everybody, like creating space for responsiveness seems to be a major ingredient in care. Yeah, that we create these spaces wherever we are, and I'm talking especially now also research and academia. I mean, like Thich Nhat Hanh says, interbeing, everything responds to everything, and we are part of this, and our responsive organisms respond so much more richly than maybe the language we use or the concepts we use. And making a space to this responsiveness is making space for interbeing in a way. Yeah. And so I just think the word responsiveness is very beautiful, because responsibility, it's like this little organic step towards responsibility. It's not now we are the agents, and responsibility can often be, especially also for the younger generation, that is ecologically so active, it can be so overburdening and lead to burnout and depression. And this responsiveness also has this component of caring for oneself while being responsive. So there's a lot in this term. Yeah.
Wonderful. Katherine.
Yes, it's resonating with what Donata just said, and trying to finish the thought I had earlier, and apologies for my phone, which I'd forgotten to turn off. It connects with this notion of interbeing, and I guess to encourage us in this conversation to, as Donata is indicating really, to move outside of the human bubble in terms of our notion of what sentience is about. I'm increasingly struck by, as our knowledge of other life forms increases, including now things like trees and others, of what similarities there are in terms of, without stretching the language too much, care and compassion, where you have a tree that will care for another one that's been chopped down, will nevertheless send out a branch and feed the other tree, where you have the wood wide web of fungal spores going under the surface, where trees are feeding each other, messaging one another. I mean, let alone what's happening in the animal kingdom. I think the more we know about how nature operates, the greater the similarities between ourselves and the rest of creation. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because, and for me, so therefore I'm increasingly unclear what I quite mean by sentience or consciousness, because I'm increasingly feeling that this is, we've been very restricted in our understanding of how this works at a planetary level. But also feeling that it's clear that we as human beings with enormous power and technology and so on have huge responsibility towards the rest of creation, and to care for it and to look after it, because we're the destructive element on our planet at the moment. And really feeling that that's a kind of, for me, quite an important distinction. And then just a final element of this thought is how incredibly caring for us nature can be when we turn to it in times of trouble, or when we're needing healing, over and above any human communication that may or not be too complicated or too difficult. So often people get such solace and healing from simply being in nature, without words, without intellectualization. So it really connects, I think, with Donata's point and Thich Nhat Hanh's theme of interbeing, and to make sure that when we're thinking about sentience and responsibility, we don't only think of it in human terms. Now, that's not to decry all the fantastic discussion we've just had about the importance of unconditional caring and altruism and so on. I'm not trying to shunt the human being to the side. I'm just asking us to broaden our sphere of what we mean by sentience and responsibility.
Thank you, Katherine. Elena?
Thank you, Amy. Again, embracing everything that everyone has said, and just bringing another angle in connection to what I said about care. But starting with your question, what is life? And that's a question I haven't answered for myself. And I would say that I'm not quite satisfied with any answers that have been offered, and I'm probably not the only one. Not here, not in this panel, but generally, that life has been defined. With sentience, I very much would like to echo Katherine that my definition of sentience kind of also in sort of transition, and I would only say that it seems that it's limiting to define it by ability to feel. I would, for myself at least, broaden it to ability to experience, and ability to have experiences, having an awareness of experiences, because we can at least hypothetically think of a being who doesn't feel but may have other types of experiences. And so I wouldn't limit the definition of sentience to this sort of ability to experience pleasure and pain, and therefore behave in a way of aversion and attachment that is then also linked to life somehow, in some definitions at least. And other aspects of responsibility, apart from responsiveness, which is of course, the root word, is accountability, also something Katherine has touched upon. And just to bring it back to the meaning of that in the context of being contemplative neuroscientist and science more generally, I think one of the responsibilities of a scientist is to have an honesty with oneself and others, what it is that we don't know and understand. Really to be accountable to oneself and others in not knowing. And I think this is particularly acute and has to be carefully held by contemplative neuroscientists, because we dealing with this seeming tension between frameworks of particularly Buddhism, as we, at least contemplative neuroscientists here, we work with Buddhist framework, with Dharma, and seeming incompatibility of methods and frameworks within the mainstream science and neuroscience. So that accountability of what we don't know, so we don't then try to squeeze Buddhism into the straitjacket of neuroscience, mainstream neuroscience. That's very much, for me, is the definition of responsibility, being accountable for what we know and what we don't know, and keeping things very open. And so that's what I wanted to add to the discussion.
Could I jump in here? I'm getting very excited about the responsiveness and getting outside our human bubble and unrestricted caring, because one of my concerns about sentience is precisely, as I think Elena was just getting at, it comes apart from life. As soon as you start to define it as capacity to feel, it comes apart from life. There are living things that, as far as we can tell, probably can't feel in any sense that we think of as feeling, and yet they are alive. And what do we mean by that? Maybe we don't yet know, but maybe it means that it's the kind of thing towards which we could imagine having a caring responsiveness, and therefore having a kind of responsibility. And I think that possibly the question isn't a question to be determined by better, more precise definitions and better, more controlled experiments, but really it's a question of moral imagination. That can I relate to this, whatever it might be, as something that is alive, in the sense that a caring responsiveness towards it is appropriate. So I just, and that I think to me brings out something of the unrestrictedness of compassion or of caring that is possible to aspire to, that can sometimes get shut down prematurely even if we think in terms of caring for sentient beings, because we think of sentience as the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. So I just wanted to draw some of those in together. I really enjoyed all of these contributions. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, that brings to mind, the issue of seeing things as if almost a sort of panpsychism. So like a child that treat their toy as if it was alive, or even the care with which an artisan handle its tools. So I wonder if this is really the optimal embedded attitude to have when you live in the world, because leaving aside the question of whether there is any truth in treating objects or things and animals as if they possess a soul, but the question here is, I think, and it's crucial, is it better to live in a world where everything deserves a caring attitude, or to live as if the world is basically disposable because it is inanimate? So leaving aside any ontology, but what is the best way of living in the world, in a sense? So just a thought.
Matthieu, you're muted.
Yes, to rebound on the last thing, it's not a question whether stones are have the pantheistic perspective, but if the concept of interdependence is enough, that we are so, there's no way we cannot be interdependent. So therefore, caring for the whole thing is also caring for us and for the whole of biosphere. We cannot not care for the inanimate environment and at the same time hope that we will survive. So just to rebound on a few wonderful things that were said, especially Katherine mentioned about other species. So of course now no serious scientist will deny, that so many other species have consciousness, quite refined one and even more elementary one, the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness and so forth. But there's still a strong, among what, at least in the French philosopher, the humanist one, there's basically this human supremacist view that we are all, they are nothing. And while, I prefer the quote from the French poet Lamartine, who said, we don't have two hearts, one for humans and one for animals, meaning other species. We have a heart or we don't. So that's, I think, says it all. The moment we can make a difference, even it's not elaborated intellectually between suffering and non-suffering, and surviving and not surviving, that solicits our care. And also someone mentioned about the notion of power. I mean, you remember we had a whole meeting of Mind and Life on power and care, one of the most successful of our history. And one of the points, which is very important about power and care, is that our power, since, we stopped being hunter-gatherers, have been multiplied millionfold, probably more than that. We used to throw things 12,000 years ago, maximum. But now, look at what we can do with atomic energy, with electricity and everything. But the magnitude, so we have an immense power either to do good or bad, and especially to affect, countless generations to come, which was not the case at the time of the hunter-gatherers. But the magnitude of our care hasn't grown to the same extent. And that dilemma is clearly here. And if we look at the challenges of 21st century, the biggest one being the environment, because everything else will be linked with that. Any other progress on human health, longevity, and all that could be jeopardized by that. So we face this dilemma of not being able to reconcile the need for the short term, a mother who needs to feed their kids in Africa tomorrow, or the midterm, which is everyone wants to flourish in life and find a way that not have a meaningless life. And then the long term, that we are, the future generation will say, you knew and you did nothing. So a complete lack of care. So how to reconcile that? Because they are so conflicting interests. It's not the same people dealing with the short term, the midterm, and the long term. So selfishness will not do the job. And as my favorite Marxist, Groucho Marx, said, why should I care for future generation? What did they do for me? So the only concept that will allow to seamlessly work together around the table to make a better world, having social workers, politicians, investors, scientists, and so forth, is having more consideration for others. So that's care. And it's the only pragmatic concept that can reconcile the 3 timescale and the short-term, mid-term, and long-term interest. So that becomes a very powerful concept, in fact. And just last small point, because I'm just jumping from one thing to the other, remembering Francisco's essay on ethics. And he said embedded ethics is about really what comes from your heart at the very moment. So that's why there's no question of rules. And he quotes Charles Taylor, who said that ethics is not so much what it is good to do, but what's good to be. Because what you are will determine the way you spontaneously react to someone. Do you jump in the icy water to save a kid, or you just say, oh, or you calculate, like Ayn Rand saying, I will only jump if it costs me more, the death of that child costs me more than the risk I take. So that's not what Francisco will call embedded ethics. So in that sense, I think, yes, what is good to be is all about becoming a better human being, so that whatever you do will be motivated by care and compassion, altruism. And that's also the best thing you can have, the twofold accomplishment of others' good and your own good as well. Voila.
Thank you, Matthieu. Does anybody else resound? Maybe Edel.
It's the question, and I think already maybe I'll mention it already, but we care, but how do we lose our compassion? When do we lose it? Just a question.
Well, I think there are many answers, many dimensions. I just want to point to one that maybe also takes up a few threads. I mean, I think compassion is something that needs to be cultivated also by our education. It could be cultivated much more by our education. And Matthieu Ricard just said it's not just how you act, but what you are. And I'm now connecting a few threads also back to Amber Carpenter, who said that we shut down prematurely ways of responsiveness, or that's how I continue to elaborate the point. I mean, let's say I just know this from my own children, and that the way to respond compassionately is shut down very soon by our educational systems, saying like animals don't have souls, or yes, yeah, but, and the way that our kind of responsive and felt imagination is restricted by the way we look at things is such a major intervention in the way we educate children, and the emphasis on the rational capacities, with a lack of emphasis of developing the felt responsive side. And I think that's such a major, that's really a cultural lack, I would say. I would go so far in saying that. And so there's so much to learn, or just open the gates to learn, to cultivate this very, very natural attitude of compassion.
If I could jump in here, and if you'll permit, Donata, I'm thinking of the idea that you sent to us after our brainstorming on this topic. And so if you'll permit me to quote you, you asked, what would care mean in the context of thinking? The edge, of course, features in Genlin's Thinking at the Edge. The edge is at the core of what we mean and not the margin. It is the felt center from where we think, which is not yet explicit. It needs conditions for it to be clarified. And I was very taken by the expression of your thoughts and wondered if we could talk a little bit together about these conditions for caring for the way our minds work. Maybe Donata, you could elaborate or give us something to bounce off of.
Yes, well, I from the experience of the last years of our research in embodied critical thinking, we realized that it really needs conditions. It needs a certain climate to be able to develop ideas and not to crush them too quickly. It needs, and I would say there are basic conditions of, the basic condition is a different habit of listening to each other and listening to ourselves. But there is also some kind of some kind of a climate of friendliness towards each other and curiosity, and also towards ourselves, that is important for good thinking. And I think in a culture of criticality that is so much focused on finding the blind spot in each other's thought, this kind of climate is much too little cultivated. And Hannah Arendt knew so much about it. She says you have to be a friend of yourself to be able to stand this being alone and to face all the perplexities. If we think, and if we think in an embodied way, we really face the felt dimension and the experiential dimension. And it's such a complexity, and you kind of need to be gentle with that too. And that's just something you don't really learn in philosophy or in school or so. But I can imagine that, that maybe, the mindful approaches in education start very much there. It would be interesting to hear Katherine to this.
We have a comment from Elena, then Katherine.
Mm-hmm.
Just very briefly, Donata, I've been fascinated to learn more about your framework of embodied critical thinking. But in the context of what you've just said, I'm just wondering if it would be better termed embodied discernment. And I'm thinking of this way of knowing, that immediate way of knowing that is body-based, that it's not based on critical analysis, and it's actually clearer. That discernment is clearer, that way of knowing when the head gets out of the way. So just wanted to suggest this.
It's a very good suggestion, and I would have a lot to say. Maybe we can do that, but it's a very, very good suggestion. Yeah.
So choosing is the beginning, discerning is the beginning of caring somewhere. Katherine?
Yeah, I'm just resonating with a couple of things that have come up. Both the conversation we're having now and then the earlier question about when do people stop caring, because I think they go together really. I think people stop caring, including young people, when they themselves don't feel cared for, when they're overwhelmed. So we have schools where teachers are completely overwhelmed by the pressures on them and they suffer them. And burnout is what leads to cynicism. It's worse than stress. It's when you care too much, actually, and you get tipped over into feeling cynical and angry. So that's what can happen to the adults. And I think young people in a way suffer from the same thing with the amount of overwhelm that they get from their schoolwork and the pressure, and also now from social media and the comparative world they live in of being judged and having to have likes and so on. And it's a very difficult, cruel world for many young people in which they are just overwhelmed by pressures from all sides. And somebody mentioned whether mindfulness in schools can help. I think it can, but what I would say is I think we can't rely on a particular technique that may or may not be appropriate for young people. You know, to teach sitting meditation, for example, hasn't had a great press recently with the failure of the Myriad program in the United Kingdom to show impact. So I think it's important that we don't just rely on contemplative or mindfulness-based approaches, or even compassion in the classroom as a kind of program or a set of lessons. You can't drill this into people in 45-minute chunks and then have the rest of their day as one where they're not cared for, where they're not appreciated, where they don't feel trust, where there's no solid relationship. So I think we cultivate this by the entire environments that we create in schools and also more broadly in workplaces, in politics and so on, where it has to resonate right across somebody's experience. Otherwise you get, and young people particularly have this huge dislike of being preached at by people or taught particular techniques in isolation, which they're not then seeing played out across the rest of their environment. So I think we've got to, it's more difficult to create compassionate systems and environments than it is to just sort of simply do a little intervention that you say, right, we've done 8 lessons on this, or you know, we've got this target in the workplace, or whatever we're doing. But it is essential, because otherwise you actually get a backlash and you get more cynicism and more overwhelm, and it just becomes another thing that people try to do. And there is a real tendency for that to happen. So a slightly complex answer, but I think we have to be authentic. We have to be real. We have to be real as people with one another and genuinely care, and not turn this into a technique or a thing that we do to people. And there's too much of that happening in education, I think.
Elena?
Just to add to what Katherine has said, bringing up the sort of the burnout of the teachers, and I definitely noticed on myself, both as a mother and as a teacher, lecturer, and a researcher in care of my students. It's when the need to care for oneself becomes more of a priority, when there is this level of burnout, depletion, that the care for the others becomes, you know, we become almost like self-defensive, or can become, you know, particularly if we're not trained well in contemplative practices, that need for self-protection. And so addressing that balance that I've mentioned at the beginning is work in progress for me in recent years. But I also wanted to add on the side of the students in schools, and I'm observing, you know, my own daughters, but also my godson, who's 5-year-old, incredibly energetic, very affectionate, and he's constantly getting into trouble at school for hugging and kissing another child when he makes up with them after they had an argument. At least in UK schools, children are not allowed to touch each other, to show any physical affection. This is now in place. You know, it's understandable more or less when it's from teacher to the student, and you know, we all understand the context for that. But when the children are not allowed to show any physical affection in school and get into trouble for that, the confusion that it sets in his mind, and that chiasm in him, because his mother is very affectionate and shows a lot of physical affection, it's unreciprocated, and then he constantly has to inhibit that when he finds himself in a school environment. So this is this children's starting point. So what is it that we're teaching them?
That very sad story, Elena, brings me back to my very first reaction to the question that Edel posed: is how does compassion die? How do we lose it? And we lose it in the craggy peaks of fear. Like it's fear right from the beginning, and in so many ways, and so many manifestations. It's not trivial. There are lots of culturally specific and acute expressions of it at the moment, but I think, as Katherine was kind of getting at, trying to treat one or another issue in a localized way isn't going to be as helpful as really trying to look at the roots and the systemic sort of psychological mechanisms that are underwriting this reactionary withdrawal of care that I think is pretty endemic.
Matthieu.
Good. Yes, about what Elena was saying is strikingly contrasting with in the East. You know, we have quite young children in our monastery, and each time they go out, they sort of hug it. They hold each other by the shoulder. There's very huge amount of physical contact. And well, about stop caring, I think there's one thing. I think it's, in a way, one of the factor is the sort of exacerbated sense of self-centeredness. Because if you think me all day long, basically you are taking a huge gap between you and the world. The world become either an instrument to further your personal interest or a threat to those interests. So of course, the me and the world is not a very reasonable attitude, because the universe is not a mail order catalog for your wish and fancies. But it also makes you extremely vulnerable, because everything becomes a threat. And so if you think me all day long, you are constantly on the alert, and you are so self-centered that you have absolutely no room to care for others. Now, if you are less self-centered, then you can suddenly open to others and their needs and what could be good for them. And you see that, well, then suddenly you get also strength, sort of courage, because the magnitude of the task is huge, but you can do something, and it's possible, and we're all interdependent. So, but also we should not think that it becomes, as also Elena said about protecting oneself, it's not at all necessarily a self-sacrifice. The idea that unless you suffer is not really altruistic is really silly, because it could be immensely gratifying. It's not a question of sacrificing your own interest. They go hand in hand. And you know, the famous argument against altruism is that the warm glow, you do that because you feel good. It's such a stupid argument. It's like asking the fire will burn, but there is no heat. I mean, it just burns. So it is intrinsic to goodness and to compassion and to care that also is somehow attuned to something that you feel good, because it's more attuned to something that is sort of natural within us. And therefore, it's to want to feel bad, it will be so strange. And there's nothing wrong in having the warm glow. And if you do it just for the warm glow, it probably won't work, because it's a selfish motivation. But if it comes as a bonus, as something given on top of it, and your primary motivation is to be concerned by others, remedy to their suffering, or bring them happiness, and then if you get the warm glow, is great. And if you don't, then it's still okay. You know, those who rescued people persecuted in the Second World War, I mean, certainly they didn't feel the warm glow on the spot. They were in incredible danger, putting their family in danger. But over the time, over 20 years, 30 years, they felt that one of the best thing they ever did in their life. So this a long-term sense of that was right, that was a sense of ultimate gratification in meaning of your life. But on the spot, it probably was a great tragedy to risk your life, the life of your family, to hide someone who was, sort of looked after by some dictator and so forth. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Matthieu. Giuseppe.
Yeah, I think Matthieu hinted to something very important, and it's the word motivation. And maybe that was, Katherine said that many of the program in the UK that introduced mindfulness or compassion in the schools didn't quite work as expected. Because now, what is the underlying motivation for engaging in those type of programs? So if it's something that it's your it's just a personal enhancement because it may help you become more successful, or having less stress, but now the crucial and the difficult part is, where does true motivation for altruism or compassion comes from? As Matthieu knows, that type, let's say, compassion meditation, or it works in the traditional monastic setting because the motivation is there in the first place. It's not used to gain some more success. Or now, where does it come? Where can it come from, this meditation? Is this really the role of religion? Is it, what is the narrative that entices you, fascinates you to adopt that meditation? So I can see Matthieu has already an answer. So
Unmute.
Please go ahead.
I don't want to speak too much, but what was it? Sorry, I lost the track now.
No, I was saying, where does the good motivation really comes from? Is it provided by a religious narrative?
No, yes, of course. Yeah. What the Lama has been saying so many times, half of humanity is not behaving according to religion, even they belong to something. So if you say that compassion is to religion, that's bad news, because we need compassion from the day we're born till the day we die, and whether we're religious or not. And we could say it's the golden rule, and whatever is the foundation of all religion built on that. But it's much more basic, fundamental, and you could enhance it if you practice a religion or spirituality in the proper way. Then all of them give you tools to nurture, cultivate, enhance, making far bigger and vaster and profound your compassion, altruism, and so forth. But it's no way it can be, the monopole of religion. Otherwise, we are really bad start. So that's why it's something that is so fundamental and so basic that it is necessary for every single sentient being from our birth to our death. Yes.
No, I agree and I understand. But my question was, so as I said before, Katherine was saying, many of these programs didn't work, and I think it didn't work because the underlying good motivation was not there in the first place. So where does it come from? Where does it come from when it's not? I mean, because there are instances, obviously, when it's not there. So I wonder if you have to be captivated by some vision that traditionally was provided by religious narratives, but it may be provided by something else. But okay, go ahead, please.
If I could just comment, I might have slightly over-egged the pudding earlier, as we say in England. I wouldn't want to give the impression at all that mindfulness programs and compassion-based programs in school are useless and never work. On the whole, they do. They do make a difference, particularly when done with the right young people at the right stage of their development and in the right way and in a good supportive context where they have support. What they don't do is where they're imported, and in the case of the Myriad program, as a piece of research-based work, which was very much driven by the research, and when they're a hit and run, and they're not supported by that wider context. So I think they do help. They can actually generate work, open people's eyes to what's possible. They can themselves be catalysts to change. So we mustn't dismiss them all. But nor must we think that 8 sessions of mindfulness in a school is going to be a magic bullet that always makes a difference. It's a more subtle business than that. And as I said earlier, we have to be very careful about backfiring if you do it in the wrong context. But I think the evidence is that on the whole they help, but they're much more powerful done in the right context, and in the wrong context they can backfire. I just wanted to kind of correct any impression I might have given about that.
No.
Sorry,
I'm sorry, I exaggerated, but when you say context, yeah, I read it as prior belief. So that is the basis for what I mean by motivation. So that was my whole point. It doesn't need to be. I'm not saying that this motivation needs to be provided by, dogmatic religion, but even the basic structure of religious sentiment, which may be, believing that good may exist in the world. Let's say, like this, the really elementary skeleton of religion. That I don't know. I wonder if that is necessary.
Edel.
Well, my idea is that religion or not, we care. And that motivation is there already. But again, I come to the same point. How do we lose it? And then, well, it's clear. It's during our education, all the things that happen, fear and all that makes us lose it. A child, when it sees a sick bird on the ground, he wants to take care of it, and then the parents say, no, that's nature, and they give a reason not to do it. And so, for me, the question is, actually, we care. Okay, what can we do? What can we do to add to that, to prevent it from going away? What can we do to not to motivate people, but to prevent the demotivation? And then the question comes to us: what can we do?
Yeah, I had a final question here that relates to that. Maybe we could answer briefly and give the audience some time to ask some questions. There have been some questions that come up. And one of the things that I had a question that was worded somewhat like, we're standing at the edge in a precarious world. How can we care? That wasn't quite the question, but it was sort of, how can we care along with all this? And one of the things that I've learned from listening to you is that, in fact, if we can live caring lives, it's because we're precarious beings standing on the edge. And that edge is the center, as Donata so beautifully put in her communication with us. And so as a final question, so before we can bring some people in, I just wanted maybe each of you to say something perhaps personal. It doesn't necessarily have to be about what your challenges, what you see as being the biggest challenges to enacting care in our present world as we're living it today. seeing care as being an action, seeing, as Amber said, seeing caring as being something that efficient agents do in the world, but in a world in which they are embedded and webbed.
Maybe I don't know if I answer your question, but I am in the field, I hope. And so there's one thing that can make me very hopeless, and the same thing that can make me hopeful, is that as we learn more and more, everything is interconnected, and we see how many things that so many things interconnect, so things go wrong. So many levels come together. So many levels come together. The way we conceive the world and an economic system, and the way we personally, up to the point that Elena's nephew, or I don't know, is not allowed to touch it. But the other way around, because of this interconnection, it encourages me so much to more and more believe that the act of caring that we try to enact wherever we are, whether it's in the academic system, or that it also has a huge effect, that it also, and that we don't even know how effective it will be. And I believe this more and more, because there was really a time that said, well, what difference does it make? But if we are in this entangled mesh of interconnected and responsive life, then there's not a logical order to change. Yeah, and that kind of, I hold on to that.
Elena?
Just to answer very briefly, more things might come, but the first thing that came is the main challenge I see, both personally and professionally, and as a practitioner in enacting care in many different ways, is the polarization of the world that we live in. And as Amber very astutely put her finger on it, fear-based living of some of our fellow human beings, and others who naturally seem to be motivated by asserting goodness as really existing in the world, and at least motivated, if not always able, to be and act out of love and unconditional compassion. And Donata said that sort of creates that constant, it's not even a tension, but it's like one step forward and two steps back. And it's just having that patience and openness to keep on making this one step forward, no matter how many times we find ourselves thrown back because of this polarization we're still facing as humanity.
Edel. Thank you, Elena.
I resonate, if I understand you well, with Donata, that we tend to see things too big. It's the small things. It's the small things. Care starts at breakfast, or in traffic, on the street, in your work, in our work. And when do I stop caring? When I start thinking something is more important, and then I lose myself. And luckily, from time to time, my meditation cushion brings me back. And then I say, oh yeah, oh no, it happens here in the small things. And these small things are not small. Something I often say in my Zen group is, how big is my responsibility? Well, in my case, 1 meter 82. That's everything. And it's only 1 meter 82, but it's everything.
Thank you. Thanks, Eva.
That's really lovely. If I could pick up on that. if I look at where are my compassion failures, my failures to care, it's going to be the moment, the things right now, right here before me. When do I fail? It's when I'm exhausted and distracted, and usually distracted because I'm exhausted, and exhausted because my attention is torn in 10,000 different ways, none of them allowing me to just grant the importance of what's in front of me that it deserves, each thing that's right here, right now. And I think there's a lot that there's a certain amount that individuals can do to combat that, and there's a certain amount that it would be fruitful. There could be imagined fruitful changes in our environment that could at least reduce the forces that drive us towards distraction and exhaustion.
Yeah. Now that's very interesting, Amber, because it points to a kind of a situation that it's a bit paradoxical. On one hand, we say that care is something natural, but I agree with your experience. We kind of stop when you are exhausted, and cognitive scientists know that when you are exhausted, you are distracted, you fall back on your habits. So why these habits make you behave in a careless way, or not careful, or not caring? It's interesting. I don't know. I'll leave it at that, but maybe it's some fuel for further thought.
Elena.
Giuseppe, but I would like to sort of ask here, but is it falling into the habit really, or is it starting to lean, I kind of brought in that notion of self-protection in the context of when we are depleted and exhausted, because it's then, fear comes back. It's a threat to our survival, which is deeply engraved. And then, the priority becomes protecting oneself, one's energies level, rather than a habit, right? And therefore having that balance of maintaining one's own well-being, right? So we continue that, to emanate that care into the world, so we don't have to collapse on ourselves. And Matthieu responded to that point I was making, and completely agree with what he said. But we do find ourselves, so I find myself in my world, trying to be it all, a mother and a researcher and this, that, and the other. Sometimes we do have too many responsibilities and don't give enough time to caring for our own well-being. And so remind ourselves that has to be factored in. Otherwise, everything else falls apart. And I always, remind myself, with my teacher, Rimshe, who has multiple responsibilities, looking after nunneries and all the students and his own family and so on and so forth. But he doesn't become depleted and collapse on himself, because practice is something that is done every day, or I don't know, don't follow his practice schedule, but I would assume that takes priority. And that's a way of maintaining well-being, so we don't collapse into fear and self-protection through depletion and exhaustion from too many responsibilities that we take upon our shoulders.
No, yes, definitely. That is an important aspect. Maybe habit was not the correct word, but maybe it's something like we fall back to the most effortless mode of behavior. So that means that care needs to be, it's an active stance. It needs to be engaged in a sense. But Matthieu wanted to say something.
Oh, it's okay. But yes, what about the exhaustion and the distraction aspect? There may be two components here, as you know, the empathic and the compassionate component. So the empathic component obviously has a limited amount of sort of resources that you have, because this way it affects you basically when the suffering of others affect you, that's kind of emotional empathy. It's the effect it has on you. So it's self-oriented. And so while compassion and come with a kind of courage that even you are exhausted, there is this way of being that is still there, even though you don't have the resources and the capacity of attention and being attentive enough, and because you are too exhausted, you need to replenish your capacity to do something, but it should not possibly affect the deepest level of compassionate courage. And just to also bounce a little bit on what Donata was saying, in a way, we could say that a proper understanding of interdependence is the foundation for altruism, compassion, and care. And it starts actually with recognizing that if it was at all possible, I'd rather not suffer. You know, if we don't wake up in the morning thinking, may I suffer the whole day and possibly my whole life. So if we recognize that first in ourselves, then we are concerned. What should I do to avoid suffering, and what should I? So anyway, we try to distinguish what will bring more suffering and what might free us from suffering. You care for that. You care for your own well-being. And then with the interdependence, we say, well, anyone, whether we are confused or not, somehow, basically, fundamentally, would rather not suffer. So that's our most common denominator, no matter how you define happiness or whatever. But the wish to survive, not to suffer, is very deep. And even, you know, people who think they are not made for happiness and they are bound to suffer, if it was at all possible, they would certainly take the chance. So to recognize that basic aspiration makes our common humanity, and in the same way that I'm sort of concerned not to do something that will harm me in the short and long term, then the ethical component means I become concerned what will be the impact of my thought, words, and action on the happiness and suffering of others. So this somehow, the interdependent sense of common sentience, common humanity, is the kind of foundation for, you know, cultivating this increasingly vast sort of compassion. But then the exhaustion it's more about the emotional level, and also the very capacity that you might have, even physically, or the resources you have at your disposal. That's why the burnout comes out in so many people who are social workers and caregivers and so forth, because there's that much at some point you can do, and you can feel, and you can fathom. I mean, you can sort of bear just to be functional. Yes.
Thank you, Matthieu. Thank you all. Gabor, do you would you like to open up the floor for the, if everybody has the resources to take a few questions?
Yes, let's do that. Johanna, would you like to lead the discussion and moderate the questions?
Sure. Thank you. We've had a number of really stimulating questions come from the chat already. And I know, Anna, you've had your hand raised for a while now. So maybe we can let you unmute yourself and articulate your question. I see you also put a question in the chat. So why don't you go ahead?
Yes. Well, my background has some importance to what I'm going to say, because I've been studying and practicing Buddhism for 40 years. And the more I go, the more impressed and happy I am. But the organization is Mind and Life. In this, today, we did not define life. And yet, in the outer world, I mean, non-Buddhist world, there's a lot of debate now about what is life, but we ignore that. But we talk about care, and we jump immediately to sentient beings. If we talk about sentient beings, we are in a Buddhist ghetto. Nobody else will know what you're talking about. It's a kind of a local samsara. Buddhists talking to Buddhists with Buddhist terms. Even compassion. In the outer world, people talk about love. That makes sense to them. So I think for me, there's a real problem there, you know, and just a few things, you know, in terms of life. In France, I have some auto-reference which made me think about, you know, I can write them down. If people are interested, I can give you references, things that made me think about life also. And other question, do you know your motivation? I don't think myself, I don't think I can access my motivation, knowing what part of ego is there, what non-ego. I think for me, it's not an operational concept. For instance, in the Buddhist, in the Jewish tradition, we don't talk about motivation. When you do something or start a practice, you set an intention, and the intention that you can formulate. And your intention is a mix of other things, but an intention is not a goal either. You set an intention. I kind of challenge you to access your motivations. Okay, and if people are interested, I'll put my email and I'll send you references about work being done on life and also on care. There are some people in France I know who are working on care, so I can send you references, most of them in French, okay? You know, for instance, just to give you an example, do you know, what's his name? There's a French ethno-psychiatrist who's working at Toby Nathan, and he has an interesting definition of life. There's a Philippe Descola, who is the leading French anthropologist right now. There's Cynthia Fleury, who's a philosopher. And also for me, as a reference in English as a philosophy, well, there's Eugene Gendling that, of course, Donetta is, of course, because in Gendling, there's a lot more than embodied critical thinking. There's a philosophical basis which could help think about care. So that's it.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Very, very good point about intention and motivation. Thank you.
Feel free, Annie, if you'd like to put some of the references also in the chat, that'd be wonderful.
Yes, I will.
It's great. We also had a question. I know, Aida, you had a question way back, which was an interesting one we want to maybe bring into the space, if you could.
Yeah, hello, everyone, and thank you for this. I think my question was answered on some level. It was put differently. My question was, how do you think individual and collective reactivity influences our ability or capacity to care? So is it a hindrance? And of course, I put it a little bit like a rhetorical question because I have my own answer to this. But I would love to hear something from you. But before that, I would like to say that we are actually, an international group is working on a course which is called Mindfulness-Based Ethical Living, a Practice to Care. So it's very much about caring. It's a pathway to care, let's say, a practice of care. And it's based on Stephen Batchelor's ELSA concept. Some of you might know this, and it's with permission and support from Stephen Batchelor that we are working on this. And there we work a lot with reactivity as the kind of psychological framework of mindfulness, and then we come to contemplative mindfulness, and then to an ethics of mindfulness or ethical mindfulness, which is actually the Eightfold Path, but we don't use any Buddhist jargon in this course. Thank you again.
very briefly, I know we don't have time to unpack this, but the model that I would find interesting to look at there in relation to reactivity in the context of what we discussed here is that exhaustion, multiple demands we have in our Western society, exhaustion leads to reactivity, depletion leads to reactivity, reactive mind leads to further depletion. And so it's a downward spiral. I'll leave it at that. And then, of course, we will lose care for all the reasons that we discussed today already.
I'm wondering if we can also turn to this question, and we can return to your question, Aida, maybe as we move along. But I'm also wondering if we can bring up Ruben's question. Ruben, if you're still here, that'd be great to hear you articulate your question, because it's something we didn't touch on directly, but I think is worth drawing out if you're here.
If I may speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just wondering briefly about the connections between care and enactive approaches to understanding the world. I'm sure that, the speakers have already mentioned many things, but maybe some final thoughts on this connection, if possible. Thank
you. Could you repeat it, please? So I didn't quite.
Oh, sure. No, I'm just wondering about the many connections between enactive approaches to understanding the world and care as a practice, and and I know that there's many levels, and I know that you've touched already on some of these levels. But I was just wondering if perhaps you may want to say a few more things about this on any level. And I know that it's a very vague question, so sorry for that.
I think that approaching the world with this type of attitude, with care, enhances a lot the epistemic value of our actions. It's of course this is tied. It is tied to attention, but I think that care is more underscores a more does not neglect the more embodied affective part of knowledge. So, but it definitely emphasizes the boundary between the self and the world. That when approached with that type of attitude, I think it makes almost like there's acting with care enhances the epistemic import of these actions. In a sense, that's my feeling, my intuition. That it, of course, it would need to be unpacked much more, but.
I think also, Ruben, that the enactive approach is, if you could put it this way, some sort of a scientific buttressing for understanding from one small point of view, and that's the scientific point of view, interdependence. If our relationship with the world is a dialectical one, is a dialogical one, as the enactive approach puts forward, then we're forcibly in a situation of a network, a complex network. So for me, the enactive approach, one doesn't need to have a scientific version of it, but is certainly a way of visualizing the paradoxical nature of the individual agent within a web. that makes caring radical?
And may I just add, in very simple terms, to just add your sentence, that also with an active approach, caring is a path. Yeah, the more we care, the more we change, the more our boundaries, so-called, to the world changes, the more the way we can sense change, the more we think change, the more our environment change. So all of that together. So it's very different, like a care ethics, that you have a few values, but it's a path changing everything.
Could I just ask whether it would be a sympathetic addition to say that it gives us a different way? So the orientation of the inactive approach gives us a different way of thinking about what care is, not as something that I, an agent, do to something else, a piece of the world, but one kind of manifestation of this way in which we are embedded and interacting always, and never just an agent acting on a passive world.
Well, if I may add a little teaser about what you just said, Amber, as actually, when we speak of paramita, the perfect action, we say it's only perfect, and that applies to care, obviously, where we lose the sense of I'm doing it, I'm the subject, here's the object, and here's the action. We call that the three wheels. As long as you intensely grasp and verify those three, then it's by nature limited in its effect, in its value, in its contribution to actually go towards unconditional care. So the less we have those fixation on subject, object, and action, the more, I mean, from Buddhist perspective, it will be vast and profound and eventually successful. So, sorry.
Thanks, Ruben, for this question. We could keep going on this for a long time, I think. I'm aware of the time, and we did have a really interesting question from Charles Hastings, but I think we will try to address this question in another circle or panel or discussion. He was asking about what can MLE suggest to address the situation of burnout in a particularly competitive environment for a lot of academics today. This is something we're thinking a lot about at MLE, and we're probably going to have a discussion around that specifically at some point. But we did want to invite Father Francis, if you're still able to join your voice here. You had a couple of comments and also maybe a comment that resonated with a few of the questions we had earlier on, specifically about the role of religion, also about young people. If you can unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Echo. All right, here we go. Okay, here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. Yeah, one of the things that touches on the motivation question is that other question about rites of passage for teenagers, young people, and so on. And I think maybe some of the problems that were encountered in the UK study on mindfulness training in schools perhaps didn't take into sufficient consideration the anthropology of motivation in groups. So maybe what we need to look at also is fascination. What is it that you have attention, but then you have the heating up of attention through fascination, desire, eros, you might say. That is a kind of an emotional quality that makes a person want to do sports, want to do science, want to do spirituality or whatever. And this is something that awakens fairly early on in a person. This is why some of the comments on sensitive, Donatella's comments on sensitivities to students, to creativity, to imperfect ideas that are coming along. All of this is a way of teasing out the emotional quality that leads to fascination and eventually engagement, all right, and action. So that the whole theme of caring, as Amy has rightly put it, is this wonderful emergent property when there is fascination, when there is eros, when there is desire, when there is attraction. In a certain sense, intention that Annie mentioned requires an external feature that draws our attention and then heats it up through fascination. All right, and so these patterns are assisted by ritual activity, by community life. It's how a community works. It's how a village grows a child. And so I think that these are things that we can explore further in future dialogues.
Great. Thank you, Father Francis. Maybe we should actually leave it on those very words. Amy, did you want to close things up with a couple of words? Or
simply words of thanks for all of you watching, and having all sorts of questions surely in your minds, and keeping the fascination heating up, to use Father Francis's terms. And thank you for all the panel members for your engagement and your utter thoughtfulness about this topic. I'm really looking forward to this year that we're going to spend around caring for life. And it's already started on your screen, because we have our next event, which is very linked, obviously, to caring for life, in front of our eyes right now. Johanna, would you like to say something about this?
Sure, thank you. And thank you once again to all the panelists and everyone who joined us tonight. As you mentioned, Amy, under the larger umbrella of Caring for Life, we are going to have a Mind Matters series, which will be focusing this year on one particular expression of caring, which is the Gaia perspective, or the Gaia hypothesis. And this will be our first public talk of the year. And I know Bruce Clark was with us this evening and offered a really nice reference in the chat. So if you have time, have a look at that. But Bruce Clark and Sébastien Dutreuil will be offering a talk called Gaia's Voices, a scientific collaboration of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. That'll be on February 15th. So you're all invited to that, and to continue the exploration of the theme throughout the entire year with us. Thank you so much for joining us, and take care.
Thank you, Johanna, and Gabor for organizing this, and Amy for chairing it, and also thank you to all my fellow panelists. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.